The sand beneath the Romans' feet was red from heat and blood. 40,000 men against almost 1 million, an imbalance that even now seems insane. At the end of the 2nd century BC, when Rome seemed to have reached the peak of its power, a storm arose on its northern borders. Waves of barbarian tribes, Cimbri and Teutones, moved towards Italy, sweeping away everything in their path. There were so many of them that ancient authors wrote, "They marched like the sea," and only one man dared to stand between them and Rome, Gaius Marius. But how was he able to stop what was impossible to stop? And why do his tactics still inspire admiration in military academies worldwide? The answer to this question is hidden in the sands of Gaul and in the iron discipline of those who knew how to turn fear into order. Historians, such as Plutarch and Livy, wrote that the Cimbrian invasion began around 103 BC. These peoples migrated from northern Europe, probably from the lands of modern Denmark, and moved south, destroying Roman armies one after another. In the Battle of Arezzo, the Romans lost more than 80,000 warriors. It was a disaster, comparable to Cannae. The army that was supposed to defend the empire vanished in a single day. At this moment, Marius, the newly elected consul, faced a seemingly hopeless task: to create a new force from the remnants of the army. But what he did not only changed the course of the war, but also the very structure of the Roman state. First, he changed what any army starts with: people. Before him, soldiers had to be landowners, capable of buying their own equipment. But Rome was exhausted by wars, and there were almost no such citizens left. Marius made a radical decision. He allowed the poorest strata of society to serve, those who had nothing but their bodies and their will. Thus appeared the Marius's mules, a nickname given to soldiers because each of them carried up to 30 kilograms of weapons, armor, food, and building tools. This Marian revolution changed the very essence of the Roman army. Now the legion became not a gathering of landowners, but a professional machine. The term Marius used to describe discipline was disciplina militaris, not just order, but a way of life where every movement, every sound, even breathing, was subservient to a goal. Archaeologists found in Gaul pilum heads, heavy spears with which legionaries struck the enemy at close range. Their iron tips were deliberately made soft, so that after impact they would bend and could not be thrown back. This was a weapon not of brute force, but of calculation. Every element of Marius's army was constructed with mathematical precision. The imagination paints this moment: a dusty road along which stretches a column of 40,000 men. No luxurious supply trains, no privileges, only people, shields, spears, and one breath for all. Each legionary carries on his back his own future and the future of Rome. From afar, it seems as if it's not an army moving, but a single living organism of metal and sweat. And yet, ahead of them awaited not just a battle. Ahead was a nightmare that even Marius could not foresee. A clash with a barbarian mass so immense that the Romans for the first time doubted, could man stand against sheer numbers? And it was at this moment that the story of that very insane tactic, which saved Rome, began. The Romans marched north for weeks. Each day began with the dull clang of metal. Centurions struck their staffs against shields, rousing the soldiers. First, spelt bread and water with vinegar. Then, a march up to 20 kilometers long with full gear. Plutarch wrote that in Marius's army, a soldier was one who knew how to endure. And it was this endurance that became a weapon more formidable than a sword. To understand the scale of the impending horror, one must know this: a living wall of tribes moved against Marius. Sources claim that there were no fewer than 300,000 able-bodied men among the Cimbri and Teutones, and together with women and children, up to 1 million people. They carried with them wagons, livestock, utensils, entire peoples on the move. This was not an army's campaign, but a migration of a world. The rumble of wheels and the bellowing of cattle lasted for days. When scouts reported the size of this procession, the legionaries were silent. Even veterans had seen nothing like it. Marius understood that an open battle with such a number of enemies was suicide. He chose what would later be called the tactic of slow burn. In the modern world, it can be compared to an exhausting strategy in boxing, not to strike first, but to make the opponent wear himself out. This is how Marius acted against the barbarians. He did not rush into battle, he made the enemy wait. He built fortified camps on hills, surrounded by ditches and ramparts. Every day legionaries dug the earth, erected walls, and trained, while the Cimbri waited, losing discipline and patience. This constant work was the foundation of a new principle, castra, the fortified camp. It became a symbol of Roman military engineering. Each camp was perfectly square, with ditches, gates, and a main street, via principalis. Even enemies said, "The Romans build as if they intend to live here forever." Archaeologists still find traces of these camps today, remnants of ditches and stone hearths, laid out with such precision as if made by 21st century engineers. But while the legionaries dug the earth, the barbarians lost their minds. Their leaders, Boiori and Tudabad, did not understand why Marius was inactive. They were accustomed to an enemy who rushed into battle. But here, silence. Only torches at night and neat lines of tents on the horizon. The barbarians tried to draw the Romans out, staging demonstrations of force, striking spears against shields, roaring like beasts. But Marius did not respond. He waited. He knew that war was not about anger, but about time. Then he employed what modern officers would call psychological warfare. He sent detachments on short raids, strike, burn a supply train, disappear. The barbarians began pursuit, losing formation. When they returned, they found Marius's camp already fortified and impregnable. This was the Roman way of saying, "We are here forever." Key to this approach were the signals, tubae and cornua, brass trumpets and horns, by which commanders controlled thousands of men. Imagine a wall of sound, a low rumble echoing in the chest when a legion received an order to move. For the barbarians, this was a sign of power, sounds that subdued space. Marius understood that discipline was not merely order, but a form of fear. He taught legionaries to hold formation even when they wanted to flee. His centurions carried staffs, vitis, and used them not on enemies but on their own if someone broke the line. For cowardice, 1 out of 10 was executed, a procedure called decimation. Historians debate whether Marius used it often, but the threat itself made the legion iron hard. By midsummer, the barbarians lost patience and divided. The Teutones moved south towards Provence, hoping to break into Italy. The Cimbri remained in the north. Marius waited precisely for this, the division of the enemy. Now he could fight not 1,000,000, but half the force. The battle that was to decide the fate of Rome occurred by a river, whose name Livy preserved as Axi, and later sources call Aquae Sextiae. Here Marius set up what a modern strategist would call a perimeter trap. He had pre-selected a site where hills and ravines turned the plain into a deadly labyrinth. Before the barbarians' eyes, he set up camp, as if challenging them to battle. But at night, a part of the legionaries hid behind a hill. They were to strike from the rear at the very moment of attack. At dawn, the earth trembled from the steps of the barbarians. The Teutones marched in a dense mass, shouting to drown out their fear. The legionaries stood in silence. Marius ordered them to wait until the enemy was within pilum-throwing distance. Silence and the thud of hooves. 2 worlds collided at that moment. When Marius raised his hand, the Romans hurled their spears. Hundreds of barbarians fell. The remaining mass crashed into the shields. But this was only the first act. Beyond the hill, dust was already rising. The second part of Marius's army was preparing to deliver a blow that would go down in history as one of antiquity's most brilliant decisions. Everything happened in a matter of minutes. As the barbarians crashed into the Roman line, the ground trembled as if alive. The roar was so immense that even officers could not shout over their soldiers. The Teutones, tall, with long braids and oak shields, surged forward like a storm. But the Roman formation did not budge an inch. Legionaries in the front ranks relied on short swords, gladiuses, which were intended not for sweeping blows but for short, precise thrusts under the ribs. In close quarters, this weapon turned everyone into a mechanical blade. The clang of metal, the cries of the wounded, the smell of blood and sweat, everything mingled into an unbearable chaos. But Marius did not raise his sword. He stood on the hill and waited for the signal that was to decide everything. The sun beat down, reflecting off helmets. Below, the Romans bent under the barbarian onslaught. It seemed that the formation was about to waver, but it was then that a sound rang out that changed the course of the battle. The low hum of a horn, a cornu. This was the signal for the hidden detachment lurking behind the hill. During the night, Marius had ordered several cohorts, about 4,000 men, to flank the enemy. They hid until dawn in a ravine, lying under cloaks and breathing into the ground so as not to betray themselves with the steam of their breath. Now they rose and struck the Teutones in the rear. At this moment, the Romans in front transitioned from defense to offense. The barbarians found themselves between two fires. This was the classic double jaw, a maneuver that would later be called an encirclement maneuver. Modern military historians call this strategy a pincer movement. At the time, Romans said it more simply, circumvenire, to go around, seize, close in. And that is exactly how Marius's legions closed the ring. Hundreds of barbarians tried to break out, but heavy shields and spears deprived them of mobility. Those who fled ran into Roman traps, ditches, and stakes dug in advance. The entire area around the camp turned into a giant meat grinder. Archaeological finds in the region of modern Aix-en-Provence confirmed the scale of the slaughter. Scientists found dozens of pilum heads, sword fragments, and bones pierced by Roman caligae spikes, military sandals driven into the ground to prevent slipping in blood. These findings confirmed the words of ancient chroniclers. The battlefield after Aquae Sextiae was littered with bodies. But the most astonishing thing happened after the victory. When the battle ended, the remaining barbarians, women and children, took refuge in their camp on the hill. They did not ask for mercy. According to Plutarch, the Teutonic women killed their children and themselves to avoid falling into slavery. This act of despair shocked even hardened Romans. The victory was so terrible that, as Appian wrote, the air above the valley long smelled of death. For Rome, this was the first real respite after long years of humiliation. News of Marius's victory spread throughout Italy. He was called the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus. But Marius himself understood. The second half of the storm still lay ahead. The Cimbri, learning of their allies' demise, moved south. And now everything depended on whether he could meet them before they burst into Italy. At this moment, another symbol of Roman military genius was born, the march. Modern historians compare the speed of Marius's legion's movement to modern army maneuvers. In a day, soldiers covered 25 kilometers over rugged terrain, carrying up to 30 kilograms of gear. This was not just movement, it was a test of survival. Hence the expression, Marius's mules. A legionary carried everything on his back: helmet, chainmail, spears, a mess kit, bread, a shovel, and even a pole for erecting fortifications. The main principle of this new army was autonomy. Each soldier was his own quartermaster and engineer. When the legion stopped, a fortified camp was already standing within 30 minutes. Overnight, they turned a deserted hill into a fortress, and at dawn, they disappeared like ghosts. It was then that a new type of officer appeared, the legates. These were not aristocrats, but professionals who had grown up in wars. They understood that victory was not in glory, but in calculation. The legate ensured that each cohort moved, ate, and slept on schedule. One mishap could cost an entire legion. In the north, at the foot of the Alps, the Cimbri were already preparing for invasion. There were even more of them than the Teutones. Sources say up to 250,000 warriors. They carried shields covered in fur and spears adorned with skulls. They believed that the spirits of their ancestors would lead them to victory, and the Romans believed only in order. And now, two forces, two worlds, two ways of war marched towards each other. On the plains of northern Italy, a battle was brewing that would decide whether Rome would exist tomorrow or if the world would be engulfed by a barbarian storm. At dawn, as mist still lay over the plains by the Po River, the Roman army formed up in marching order. Gaius Marius stood on a small rise, watching his legionaries arrange themselves in lines. According to Plutarch, he never raised his voice. He gave orders calmly, and in this calmness, confidence was felt. Before him lay the plain, beyond which, like a dark sea, rose the ranks of the Cimbri. There were so many of them that, as ancient authors wrote, all the hills became people. The Cimbri arranged their wagons in a semicircle, turning them into a wall behind which stood women and children. This was their world in miniature. They had come not to fight, but to live, to conquer land for themselves. But before them stood the machine that Marius had created. He didn't just build an army, he rewrote its DNA. Now every legion was precise, like a mechanism. Marius understood. A direct battle with such a number of opponents was suicide, so he used a stratagem that historians would later call deep reserve. He positioned the legions in 3 lines, leaving a third of the troops behind, invisible to the enemy. When the Cimbri rushed forward, thinking they faced the entire army, these hidden ranks were to close the circle. The key word of that day was manipulus. This was the basic unit of the Roman army, consisting of approximately 120 men. They acted like cells of a single organism. Each manipulus knew when to retreat, when to close ranks. It was this flexibility that distinguished the Romans from the barbarian mass, where everyone fought for himself. At noon, the Cimbri advanced, first slowly, then faster and faster. Their leaders shouted. Drums beat to the rhythm of their steps. Hundreds of horns roared in unison, and the ground beneath the legionaries' feet vibrated. This was not an attack. It was a torrent. At first, the Romans simply disappeared into this avalanche. But then Marius's formation began to work. The front line of legionaries drove their pila into the ground at an angle. They created a barrier against spears and horses. Then followed a short whistle, the tribune's signal. At that very moment, the first line took a step back, opening space for the second. It hurled its pila. Thousands of spears flew like rain, their iron tips bent upon impact, getting stuck in the Cimbrian shields. The barbarians tried to throw them off, but the weight of the weapons dragged their arms down. At this moment, the centurions, senior officers, each commanding 100 men, entered the fray. They were distinguished by a crest on their helmet, positioned transversely so that soldiers could see them even through the smoke. They moved along the line, shouting, "Close ranks!" and the formation indeed closed. Legionaries advanced with short steps, covering each other with shields. Where the Cimbrian attack was particularly strong, Marius introduced reserves. He used fire and sound signals, horns and smoke from torches. These signals were like a language. Each combination meant a movement, a turn, an advance. This allowed him to command 40,000 men without being in the thick of battle. The Cimbri fought fiercely. They grabbed Romans by their shields, pulled them down, tore at their faces with claws. But Roman discipline prevented them from breaking through. The battle continued all day. By evening, the ground underfoot had turned into sticky mud mixed with blood. Livy wrote that rivers disappeared in the torrent of bodies. This is not poetic exaggeration. Archaeologists still find charred bones today in the Varzella Valley where the battle took place. As the sun began to set, Marius gave his final order. The hidden reserves advanced. Fresh cohorts emerged from behind the hills and struck the flank. For the barbarians, it was like a bolt from the blue. They realized they were surrounded. Panic spread faster than sound. Those in the front ranks tried to retreat, but behind them stood wagons and women. It was a trap where every step meant death. The cries of women merged with the roar of wounded animals. The Cimbri fought to the end. According to Plutarch, their king Boiorix fell, fighting with a sword in both hands. His body was later found under a pile of his warriors. By evening, it was all over. The battlefield was an endless sea of bodies. According to various sources, up to 150,000 barbarians perished. Tens of thousands were taken prisoner. On the Roman side, losses were small, about 3,000 men. This ratio seemed impossible, but the Romans did not believe in miracles. They believed in formation, in discipline, in the idea that each person was just a part of a larger mechanism. Marius stood overlooking the valley and remained silent. He understood that he had not just won a battle, he had saved civilization. If the Cimbri had broken through, Italy would have been defenseless. But behind this victory lay not luck, but cold calculation. He proved that intellect could defeat mass, that order could break chaos. But behind this victory lay something more. Now, the army that saved Rome belonged not to the Senate, but to Marius himself. And this would mark the beginning of a new era, when the sword of the Republic would, for the first time, turn against itself. When the dust of battle over Versailles settled, the sun was already setting. The field, where swords had recently clashed, had turned into a silent graveyard. Romans with torches moved among the bodies, checking who was alive, who was dead. Only the crackling of fires and the clanging of hammers could be heard. New nails were being forged for wagons to transport trophies. Livy wrote that the earth was so soaked with blood that it could not be plowed for many years. Even the Romans, accustomed to the sight of death, were silent. They knew. Today they had stood face to face with annihilation. The Senate later estimated that over 150,000 barbarians died in the Battle of Versailles. Another 60,000 were taken prisoner. Historians dispute the exact figures, but archaeological finds in the valley confirm that a huge number of people and animals perished here. Remnants of broken wheels, arrowheads, and bronze ornaments of the Cimbrian tribes were found in soil layers a meter thick. Everything points to one conclusion. This was an apocalypse-level battle for an entire people. The Romans collected trophies, spears, shields, gold ornaments. But the most valuable trophy was not the spoils, but confidence. After decades of defeats, they once again believed in themselves. Marius became a hero, second only to Scipio Africanus. People greeted him in the streets, throwing wreaths at his feet. Plutarch wrote that crowds shouted, "Marius, savior of Italy!" But behind these shouts lay a new fear. Marius had created an army that the Senate did not control. Soldiers were not citizens defending their land, but mercenaries personally loyal to him. He gave them land, rewards, promises of a future. They fought not for the Republic, but for their commander. Thus began a new era, when Roman legions first became an instrument of power rather than of the state. From this moment, the word legion ceased to be merely a military term. It became a political weapon. Every legion could elevate or destroy any politician. Historians call this the Marian reform, but in essence, it was a revolution. It changed not only the army, but the very soul of Rome. It was also then that the concept of auxiliary troops, auxilia, appeared. These were allies, non-Romans, who were allowed to serve in exchange for the promise of citizenship. Their skills made the army versatile. Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, Cretan archers. They transformed the legion into a multinational machine. But along with this, the personal power of generals also grew. Marius was elected consul 6 times in a row, an unprecedented breach of tradition. Senators whispered that he was too popular, too powerful. The people called him the third founder of Rome, but his enemies saw in him the beginning of the Republic's end. Polybius, a century before Marius, warned, "When soldiers come to depend on the generosity of their leader rather than on laws, Rome will fall." These words seemed prophetic, for soon his army would clash not with barbarians, but with Romans. An era of internal wars would begin, when the sword that saved Rome would turn inward. But no one knew this yet. That evening, after Versailles, the legionaries sat by their campfires. They roasted meat, shared bread, sang. Their faces were smudged with soot, their armor covered in mud, their hands trembled with exhaustion. But a fire burned in their eyes. They knew they had done the impossible, that 40,000 men had managed to encircle and destroy almost 1,000,000. Marius walked among the fires in silence. He did not celebrate. His face was like stone. According to Plutarch, he looked at his soldiers as instruments that had accomplished their task. But in the depths of his gaze was a shadow. He understood that he had unleashed a force that would be impossible to contain. A few days later, he entered Rome. Crowds awaited him with incense and flowers. Senators placed a laurel wreath upon his head. But as he ascended the Capitol line, legionaries marched before him, the very poor men to whom he had given weapons and purpose. They shouted his name, and the city hummed like the sea. At that moment, the old republic trembled. Since then, the victory at Versailles has entered textbooks as an example of the ideal combination of tactics, engineering, and psychology. Modern officers still study Marius's maneuvers. His method, "First discipline, then strike," became a formula for success for armies of all times. But behind the cold logic of this victory lay a paradox. To save Rome, Marius had to destroy its old foundations. And when he returned to the capital, no one yet understood that this day was not only a triumph, but also the beginning of the end. For empires rarely perish from enemies. More often, from those who saved them. Several years passed. Gaius Marius was no longer the hero he was remembered as after Versailles. His glory had faded, replaced by suspicion. He became irritable, withdrawn, obsessed with power. The Senate kept him from decisions, knowing that an army capable of overthrowing the state stood behind him. But Marius could not live without war. He had created a machine, and now could not stop its movement. Meanwhile, another man returned to Rome, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Once he had been an officer of Marius, serving under him in Numidia. Now he became his rival. There was no friendship between them, only cold respect. Both knew Rome was too small for two, and for the first time, swords created to defend the Republic would be raised against Romans themselves. Historians would call this the beginning of the civil wars, but at that moment it looked different. A struggle for law, order, honor. Marius claimed to be defending the people, Sulla saving the Senate. And each had legions behind him, ready to die for their commander. The reform that gave Rome strength was now splitting it in two. Sulla was the first to attempt the unthinkable. He marched his troops on Rome. This was sacrilege. An army was not supposed to enter the city, but no one could stop him. For the first time, legions passed through the sacred gates, and spears gleamed in the capital's streets. The Republic ended not in battle, but to the sound of its own drums. Gaius Marius fled. Old, sick, exiled, he still believed he could return, and he would return. But the Rome he saved at Versailles would never be the same.